Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this Governors for Schools webinar. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. We've got quite a number of people here already, and I guess we're going to get one or two more joining us as we get through the webinar. Welcome. Hopefully everybody can hear us. Now's a good time to check your sound levels on however you're accessing the webinar this morning, and we'll give you an opportunity just to confirm that you're able to do that in just a few moments. We seem to be having a slight issue with the PowerPoint this morning. I'm Steve Barker, as you may guess by the dulcet tones of my voice, and I'm joined this morning by Linda Waghorn.
Good morning.
But Linda's name for some reason seems to have disappeared off the slide, so apologies for that. But we're here from Better Governor, actually hosting this webinar this morning, and this is one of the whole series of webinars from Governors for Schools. If you haven't joined one of these webinars before, just so you're aware, this is a completely interactive webinar. Hopefully you've all got access to the question panel. Feel free to type questions at any stage. If you'd like to come on air and ask your question, then just raise your hand on the or raise your hand by using the hand icon on the dashboard that you should have in front of you. Just a quick sound test. Can we just ask everybody to raise their hand to indicate that they can actually hear us at the moment, please? Lovely. I can see virtually everyone's hands going up there, so that's great. Thank you. I've saved you the effort. I put your hands down for you, so that's great. Thank you. So this is a hot topic session this morning, and it's called Hot Topics because hopefully these are the things that governors are either talking about, or in Linda's and my view, they're the things that perhaps we ought to be talking about in readiness for governing body meetings, committee meetings, etc. coming up this term. So we have 4 key topics this morning.
We're going to be looking at the launch of the new Ofsted inspection framework, which was launched on the 14th of May, so this week, very hot topic. We're going to be looking at the teacher recruitment website, a free-to-use website that it is the DfE's intention will and should save schools and academies money. Staying with funding, we're looking at how the DfE is planning to fully fund teacher pension increases, and then finally we'll look at the relationship and sex education regulations that again have come into force fairly recently and will have an impact on all schools from September, with a compliance period that phases into September 2020.
And that last one was actually on the 7 o'clock news I heard this morning talking about that, so we'll say more about that a little bit later. Okay, so as I say, quick reminder, this is your session, so please make it as interactive as you like by asking us questions at any stage. So we're going to talk initially about the Ofsted framework, and this was out for consultation, and in previous webinars for Governors for Schools we've actually talked about the consultation itself. The consultation closed on the 5th of April, and Ofsted made an announcement that they were hoping to publish the framework by the end of May. As it was, as Linda's already mentioned, it was actually launched earlier this week on the 14th. So that does give schools and governors a very real period of time to hopefully get to grips with that new framework before its implementation in September this year. And that quote that we've actually put at the bottom of this first slide there, this new framework puts the real substance of education at the heart of inspection and support leaders and teachers who act with integrity, I think says an awful lot about the intention behind this new framework. The real substance of education in Ofsted's minds, of course, is the curriculum. That was the main thrust behind their research, and certainly was the backbone of the consultation document. And alongside that, the phrase about leaders and teachers acting with integrity, I think is a rather veiled reference to the subject of off-rolling and perhaps overuse of exclusions, which is something that also features quite highly in the new framework, but of course is currently a little bit of a political hot potato as well. So we'll say a little bit more about that in a few moments. Carol has asked a question, can I just check we will get copies of the presentation? Yes, indeed, Carol and everybody else. If you look on your dashboard, there's a little document icon there, or there should be somewhere, or I might actually say handout, depending on how you're viewing the webinar this morning. If you click on that at any stage during or after the presentation, you can actually download a copy of the handout.
So alongside the consultation and in line with the discussions that we may have had with you in previous presentations, there was an expectation that Ofsted inspectors would spend less time looking at the actual data and concentrate more on the substance, the curriculum across all of those different phases of education. The intention here is that if you get the learning opportunities for your students in your context right, they will be fed on a diet of a rich, broad curriculum, and therefore their exam results, the impact of that education, will naturally flow without a continual measurement or a focus on overly measuring children and how well they are doing at given points, but looking at spending time on creating those rich and exciting lessons for pupils. So this has been now reflected back into the press release, that this is absolutely their intention. When they come to inspect a school, they will focus what they look at on what is being offered through the curriculum, and then test its impact by seeing how well pupils have done as a result.
And this is just a screenshot of the press release that Linda's just referred to. You can find this on the .gov.uk website. Just Google, or whatever your preferred search engine is, new Ofsted framework, and you will actually get this hopefully as the first result in your search. Significance of putting it up here is that if you scroll down, obviously we've just got the top part of the page, scroll down, and all of the new documentation relating to the framework is actually available to download there.
The only extra thing I would say there is it's talking about behaviour and personal development, and that is going to be a strong thread throughout the new inspection regime alongside curriculum. So if you've got particular pupils who have more difficulties than others, how do you tailor the curriculum to better support them?
And the two documents you've actually got on the slide in front of you at the moment, these are the two key documents that I think governors probably will find most useful in terms of downloading. Just a note of caution, if you download and print every single document on that website on the previous slide, you will actually result in quite a few trees being felled. The two key documents on the left here, you've got the school inspection handbook. If you can see in very small letters underneath it, very small characters rather underneath it, it does say section 5. This is the main inspection handbook that inspectors will use in schools, predominantly for full inspections, but of course it's also a reference aid to the shorter inspections. And short inspections are included in section 8, which is the handbook on the right-hand side. And so those two documents, certainly schools should actually have downloaded them and make themselves familiar with certainly most of the content in them, and they'd be a basis of some very good discussions with governors as well, I would suggest.
So we had some discussion during the consultation period about whether the judgments would stay the same, and there were 3 new judgments proposed, and one that looked very similar, had the same title as one in the past. That's actually been confirmed. And good schools, which previously had the section 8 inspection, which would be a 1-day short inspection, is now going to be carried out over 2 days, so slightly more in depth. And it will happen as in line with the decisions they made last September, every 4 years.
So it's an interesting one about the short inspections, whether they'll still be called short inspections. Of course, the reality is now that they are no shorter than the standard inspection.
For those of you that are fairly new to the topic of governance, I find an easy way to remember number 5 comes first. That's the big one. In depth, can change the judgments of the school. Number 8 comes next. It's a slightly smaller type of inspection, but it doesn't change the overall judgments of the school. So if you're just trying to remember, well, I'm not sure which is a Section 8 and which is a Section 5, Section 5 comes first, and that's the biggie. Section 8 is the one which is now going to be carried out over 2 days, but actually can't change the judgment, but nonetheless will be slightly more in depth. Fridolin, you've asked a question about off-rolling. We will come to that and explain that as we go along. It's a very valid question and very important, but we will come back to that, I promise. So alongside the changes to the Section 8 inspection, the proposals included a notion that inspectors would phone your school the day before the inspection, as they do at the moment, but they would then arrive that afternoon and do their on-site preparation at your school. That's changed, and what they will do is what they call enhanced prep, which is an up to 90-minute telephone call, which could be split in half, where they will speak to your head teacher in depth about the actions that have been taken since the last Ofsted inspection and the type of information they're going to need available to look at throughout the inspection the following day. Off-rolling is going to be a focus, and this is a practice where pupils are persuaded to leave the role of a school and make other arrangements for their education. And it looks like it is a request that is made by parents, but in fact it is a praxis where schools persuade their pupils to look for those alternatives. It removes their performance data, their progress and attainment data, from the school's league table results, and therefore is attractive, particularly if in years 10 and 11 the results that the progress that pupils are making would affect negatively the public examination outcomes. It is happening in some primary schools. However, it is predominantly a practice that is happening in secondary schools, and has been a focus of the research in uncovering this, and therefore there will be questions asked during an inspection to ensure that schools are not guilty of this practice. And if it is found that this is happening in a school, then the leadership management judgment may be deemed inadequate, which has an impact on all the other judgments that are made about the school. So it's really important factor, particularly if you're a governor in a secondary school, that you understand how children, if they are moving to a different school or they are moving off your school role, where are they going next? How has this happened? What are the reasons behind that? And then there is also revised guidance on inspecting governance with a slimmer approach to the information provided on how inspectors will test that, but a greater focus on those 4 core functions of governance: the vision, ethos, strategic direction, holding the school to account for its performance for pupils and staff, and making sure money is well spent with good impact.
And I think it is worth saying that obviously what this will require is Ofsted inspectors to be perhaps somewhat more knowledgeable about governance than they might have been historically. I went to a conference myself about a month or so ago now, where the Deputy Director of Schools for Ofsted was actually talking, and he confirmed that the National Governance Association had actually been commissioned by Ofsted to provide specific training for inspectors preparing for this new framework on how governance should be working in schools and how they should judge governance to be effective or otherwise. And just coming back to those 4 judgments that Linda mentioned a few moments ago, the 4 judgments are, as you can see on this slide that's in front of you now, the quality of education, which is a new judgment which replaces the single judgment which was the quality of teaching, learning and assessment, but combines it with the former quality of with the outcomes judgment rather, and they are amalgamated into something called the quality of education. But this is changed. It's not just an amalgamation of those 2 former judgments. This also now has a major focus on all of those elements relating to the curriculum that Linda was talking about earlier. We've then got a split of the judgment that formally related to personal development, behaviour and well-being, and you can see there at the top in that purple coloured box, we've got a new judgment called behaviour and attitudes. Now, Ofsted have actually explained this in the consultation and reiterated it in the press release that they believe they have evidence that suggests that parents want to know about the behaviour in schools they may be expressing a preference for their children. And obviously we know that Ofsted have had a bit of a focus on low-level disruption as an element of behavioural practice in schools over a number of years now, and I think that's what we will see reflected here.
And the personal development one, again, is a really key one. We're looking there around mental health, well-being, and other aspects of children's opportunity to progress through their education with developing skills alongside that help them to understand themselves better and how they work well.
And then at the bottom there, we've got leadership and management. Now, of course, as Linda said earlier, the name isn't new, but the way in which this judgment is actually structured has changed a little bit. And I think it's just interesting to look at the introductory paragraph in the new Section 5 handbook on this. And if I may, I'll just read the first part of that out. It says, the leadership and management judgment is about how leaders, managers, and those responsible for governance ensure that the education that the school provides has a positive impact on all its pupils. It focuses on the areas where inspection and research indicate that leaders and managers can have the strongest effect on the quality of education provided by the school. So very much about the difference that leadership, and that includes us as governors, that we're making in our schools, which ties in quite neatly into a lot of the rhetoric and perhaps the new lexicon that's evolving as far as that quality of education and specifically on the curriculum is concerned, where we've got the intention, the implementation and the impact as three key elements of that curriculum. And surprise, surprise, Ofsted have been focused on impact for a number of years, but we can see that actually coming through in that leadership and management. Is there appropriate guidance being given to the schools? Are they being led in a direction that actually ensures that the curriculum does have breadth and balance and does deliver those outcomes, equips children and young people with choices to make for the remainder of their education, the next stage of their lives, etc.
And that's where it links back to the off-rolling issue, because it mentions there specifically all pupils. And so that's where leadership and management would be judged inadequate if they aren't, if they are guilty of that practice. It fits under that head. So there's some key questions that you might want to think about in your particular organisation. There's quite a lot of new information and understanding to be developed around this topic. So you will need to think about how you'll access training. And this won't just be training for those of you that are expecting the inspection team to come sometime after September. In the absence of an Ofsted inspection, the governance arrangements become that body that holds the school to account for meeting these requirements. Ofsted merely come and check you're doing it correctly. So you do need to understand and hold the school to account for these changes in practice with inspection. You need to develop a focus on the oversight of the curriculum, and you may have structures within your governance organisation that haven't particularly focused on curriculum when looking at teaching and learning. So whether you work with a learning committee or a flat structure or whatever it is in your school focuses on previously focused on the quality of teaching, learning, assessment and outcomes, you now need to think, well, what does the intent part of the curriculum bit mean we have to do as governors to hold the school to account? How do we know it's been designed and is appropriate for all our pupils and that is broad and balanced and meets the needs of all pupils? And in the test, the pilot inspections, inspectors were asking schools, well, what about your clubs, your extracurricular? Have they been designed to meet the needs of specific pupils, and why and with what intent? And I think sometimes we don't know enough as governors about what the learning opportunities, the curriculum, not just what's taught by teachers during that narrow part of the day, but all of the other learning opportunities that are provided to pupils within school. How do you have oversight of that now, and how might you develop better understanding of that as you go on? And thinking about what an outstanding school needs to achieve under these new inspection regime, that might need a little bit more unpicking, because for many schools that have been judged outstanding, we're 3 or 4 frameworks on from the time in which they were inspected. And as governors of those schools, you need to ensure that you are still holding the school to account for that level of outstanding performance.
And I think the other point to add on that is there have been a number of schools up and down the country over the last 12 months or so who have previously been sitting on an outstanding judgment, who found themselves dropping perhaps 2 or sometimes 3 grades to an inadequate judgment, not because of anything academically, but because of failings that have been identified by Ofsted in terms of safeguarding. So we haven't talked very much about safeguarding. There's not much content in this particular aspect on it, although off-rolling has implications there. But safeguarding, of course, is still absolutely vital. Quality of overall learning in the school and ensuring that children and young people make progress, but also that they're safe, are the 2 main areas of responsibility of governors. There are lots of others, but those are the 2 absolute essentials in our schools.
And then lastly, what information do you receive as governors, trustees, about the practices in your school when pupils leave the school, and are you clear that off-rolling isn't a practice that is taking place in your school?
And I would suggest on that one that probably asking the question, does my school off-roll, is a question to reflect on. I think if one's asking the question in school, I think it's more about understanding numbers on roll, etc. Are there variations in numbers on roll from one governing body meeting to the next? And as Linda said earlier, as governors, do we know what the reasons are? There will be many pupils in schools who, for very legitimate reasons, are moving schools, transferring elsewhere. But what sort of arrangements do we have in place? If you're a maintained school, is the local authority involved in actually agreeing when those pupils can be taken off roll, in other words, off the register for the school? If you're an academy, the rules are actually notionally the same, but the procedures and the processes that are used might be a little bit different. But this is something that as governors we need to understand, because if Ofsted were to come into our schools and discover this practice and we don't know about it as governors, sadly, as with everything, it's our responsibility that we don't know, because we should be asking questions to find out. Talking of questions, not many have come through so far, so if you have any questions, this is the last slide on the Ofsted part of the Hot Topics session this morning. So if there's any specific questions on this before we move on to the next session, or next part of the session, sorry, now's the opportunity to either raise your hand or type those in. I see Penny's hand is actually raised at the moment. Penny, I don't know whether you're trying to indicate that you have a question. I'll try and unmute you and see if you do. Hello, Penny? No, I think we've lost you.
No, I don't have a question.
You don't. Okay, sorry, your hand was raised. Apologies, Penny. Okay, we have a couple of questions coming through on the dashboard here. We've got one from George, and George is saying, I'm a governor in an outstanding school. What's your view on seeking external support to help governors look for the right things in curriculum intent and impact, and for external validation of our self-assessment? It's been 12 years since our last Ofsted. I think that's a good question, George. Ofsted themselves don't like the idea of what have become a term of a phrase has been coined as mocksteds, but there's nothing wrong with making sure everything's in order. I mean, the reality is, I think Linda and I would both say there's no such thing as preparation for Ofsted. What we should be doing is ensuring that governance is effective at all levels in all schools, and Ofsted will then recognise that when they come to call. But certainly if it's been 12 years, and you're not unusual in that, a lot of outstanding schools are between the 10 and 12 year mark now, it would be sensible perhaps to engage some whole governing body development about what does outstanding governance in 2019 going into 2020 actually look like.
The other thing there I would say is your school is probably not working in isolation. So that external validation of your self-assessment, I'm assuming you're saying self-assessment of the school. If your school is working with other partners or as part of a group of schools or with the local authority, there may well be things that are already happening in school that can validate some of the views that the head teacher is sharing with you, some of the information that governors are looking at in terms of linked to school improvement advisor or MAT improvement advisor. So think what else actually helps to triangulate the information that you already receive.
We've got a question here from Carol who's asking if we have suspicions about off-rolling, what can we do? If you have suspicions, you should actually raise them in full governing body meetings, I would suggest, and seek assurance from school staff that your suspicions are not founded. If you're not getting anywhere with that, then you should actually, certainly if you're a maintained school, you should, I would suggest perhaps be contacting the local authority. I think there are a whole variety of different ways in which we can ensure as governors, because this is a statutory issue, of course. This is about statutory compliance and or non-compliance if schools are off-rolling. So I think as governors, it is our responsibility to seek that assurance from our schools, and if we're not happy, we then take it to a higher level.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And George, you've come back and said that your school is a standalone academy, and I think that in that circumstance, I would share your concerns about where you might validate what you are doing. So if you're a standalone academy, you might well have school improvement package with an external partner. If you don't, I would be surprised, and that might be something that you want to talk about. How do we know that the judgments that are being made internally meet the requirements of external validation by Ofsted? Claire had asked, are the judgments still remaining as the 4 that we had previously: outstanding, good, requires improvement, and inadequate? Yes, they published a document at the end of March saying that they would stay with those 4, although there had been through the research period a lot of discussion about whether those would remain, but they have in fact confirmed they will.
And Karen has got a question here: how can governors ensure the school link the curriculum to outside activities? Again, by asking questions, by looking to see evidence in schools. Many head teachers report back in their head teacher reports about what's going on in school, which is either extracurricular or is an enrichment activity. And certainly at this time of year, lots of primary schools will be making trips, secondary schools will be as well for that matter. But it's about thinking, well, how does this enrich the curriculum? How do these activities add breadth, add balance to the curriculum? And Linda mentioned about meeting the needs of all pupils. As governors, do we know enough about the context in which our school is operating? Do we know about our catchment? Do we know what the needs of those pupils are? All of those are, I would suggest, strategic level questions that then can actually lead into our quest for perhaps more knowledge about how the curriculum is providing breadth and balance.
I'll give you a couple of examples if that would be helpful. I was at a school yesterday delivering a session, and they're a good school moving towards outstanding, and they were looking at more able and maths, and they had a lunchtime club for their more able mathematicians to enrich that part of the curriculum. And at another school that I worked at, that I was associated with in the past, they had a problem with disaffected boys, and they ran a Saturday morning club for dads and their sons to race little model cars. And it did a lot to bring the community together and keep those boys attending school. So it's those kind of things that you know the context of your school and what it needs to do. How are you using curriculum opportunities to deliver some of those development ideas?
And we've got a question here from Michael, who's saying, we believe we're due an inspection in January 2020. Will there be any understanding, presumably on the part of Ofsted, that the framework is new and under change? Yeah, Ofsted have actually made it very clear that the concerns that they've raised about the curriculum do not apply to all schools. There'll be some schools who already go through this process of having a very clear focus on the needs of their pupils and developing, shaping, forming a curriculum that actually goes to meet those needs. If we do believe in our schools that there is some work and some development work to do, as long as we're able to demonstrate to Ofsted that we are on a journey towards getting to a stage where perhaps we have a curriculum that is more fit for purpose for 2020, then that's absolutely fine, and Ofsted have acknowledged that they will not be judging schools harshly, providing there is evidence that they can actually demonstrate they're working towards.
And it's that accuracy. If you, having looked at it, you have measured yourself against the new expectations and you understand where you are in that journey and what you need to do about it, then that is already having begun that journey. I would imagine those schools that have done less to identify where they actually sit would be judged more harshly.
We've got a question here from Zoe. I'm guessing you're a governor in a special school. Zoe, how should special schools look into off-rolling? We certainly should, if we're governors in special schools, be looking at that because those young people have very specific needs. And again, it will depend on the designation of the school in, that you're a governor in. But off-rolling perhaps doesn't have the same attraction in a special school because obviously the attainment and progress of pupils is relative to their starting points, and they're not judged in league tables in the same way as mainstream schools, and that would appear, based on the Ofsted evidence and also the evidence that was presented to the House of Commons Select Committee last year, to be the main driver for schools engaging in this practice. So hopefully it shouldn't actually be a major issue for you, Zoe. Couple of questions on clubs, clubs here, after school clubs, extracurricular provision, etc. One from Carol about the impact on staff well-being. The implication isn't always that staff run these. Many clubs are actually run by volunteers, some by charities these days. Some are being run as paid-for activities. So yeah, there is potential for conflict with you know, work-life balance and teacher workload, etc. But as governors, we have a duty of care for staff, so that's a very good question to be asking, I would suggest. And we've got a question from Geetha about would it be allowed to start a club specifically for girls to help them achieve better in maths? There were some discussions that it would appear to be breaching equal opportunities. That's an interesting question, and Linda and I were actually talking about this yesterday, day before yesterday, when the new framework was actually published. There is a section about segregation in the new framework. Comes on page 72 of the inspection handbook, the main inspection handbook, and it does say it is unlawful for schools to segregate on the basis of protected characteristics, and of course gender is one of those. It then goes on to say, however, positive action to alleviate disadvantage associated with a certain characteristic is something that would not be penalised by Ofsted, or that's the implication of it. I think if I were a governor in your school, Geetha, what I'd be asking is, you know, is it necessary for it just to be for girls? But what about boys who want to achieve better in maths? So I think if you had a, you know, if you had evidence that there is underperformance in maths specifically by girls, yes, absolutely, you'd want to do something about it, and a club may be the answer. But would you necessarily want to preclude boys from that, is a question I'd be asking.
Yeah, I would agree. What are the learning outcomes from that club when you're designing it, and does it have to be just restricted to girls, or are there some other some boys that would also benefit from having those learning outcomes available to them?
A couple of other questions just before we move on. Rosemary's got a question about will we be able to get hold of these questions. The questions as such aren't printed, but of course there will be a recording of the entire webinar, which will include where Linda and I have read out questions, and we haven't ignored any questions at all so far. So we've actually read all of the questions that have come out. If we do get a particularly high number on any particular subject, we might group them together in themes, etc. So even if we don't mention your name, we are actually covering those. So you will be able to get the recording and pick up the responses to those. We've got a couple of questions here about behaviour and its inclusion within the framework. Fridolin has actually commented that the framework seems a little vague in places, including on behaviour. The framework isn't necessarily the best place to look. I would suggest you actually look in the handbook itself, and certainly the Section 5 handbook gives quite a lot of detail. Similarly, and the wording is actually very interesting, it aligns quite neatly with that phrase I read out from the leadership and management section a little bit earlier. It says the behaviour and attitudes judgment considers how leaders and staff create a safe, calm, orderly and positive environment in the school, and the impact this has on the behaviour and attitudes of pupils. Sorry, I do think, Fridolin, that what you will find from that is that Ofsted will be gathering evidence to look at the safety, the calmness, the orderly aspects, etc. I think, does that facilitate effective learning? Because if those things are not in place, then behaviour is having a detrimental impact on learning. And there's a lot of detail. There's 4 or 5 pages actually given before you even get into the judgment characteristics. So it takes you all through the specific sources of evidence, etc., that they'll be looking at.
And there's some DFE published documents on behaviour that have come are around from the last year or so, a number of them that would give more information if that's a specific concern in your school. There's guidance to schools about how to tackle some of those things.
Okay, well, thank you for those questions. I hope that's been useful. We'll move on now to focus on just one quick question in an opinion poll, if we may, before we move to the next section. And the first poll today is, as you see in front of you now, and I'm just opening the poll, which you should be able to see on your screens now. And the question is, do you think your current governance structure provides the board, the governing board that is, with sufficient strategic overview of the curriculum? You've got 4 potential answers, and I can see people are already beginning to vote there. So we'll just give you a few moments to contemplate your response, and then please do click the appropriate button. Okay, we're up into the high 70% of people who voted now, over into the 80s. So if you'd like to vote, now's the chance to do so, because we're going to close the poll in just a few moments. Most people appear to have voted now. Yep, so I'm going to close the poll there and share those results with you. And you hopefully can see those results now. 53% of people who've responded have actually said yes. That's quite an impressive number.
I'm pleased with that.
Again, I think Linda's and my perspective on that would be, yes, we've got the structure, but are we actually ensuring that our practices reflect that governance does have that sufficiently strategic overview of the curriculum, understanding the intention behind it, which necessitates understanding context, of course, but then that real focus on impact. 16% have said no, and 14% don't know, so at least 30% will use a question there to go back to school and ask, I would suggest, and 16% are saying we're reviewing it this term, which of course is very sensible, so thank you for that.
And we specifically asked about the structure, because it's early yet in developing that expertise about what you need to do within that structure. But as long as you create the environment within your governance arrangements to discuss how you will hold the school to account for moving towards this, then I think that that's the important aspect. The reviewing it this term, some of you may have meant that you're reviewing the curriculum this term rather than reviewing your structure to provide that opportunity. But the summer term is a good point at which to look at your structure and take this on board about any changes you might want to make for September.
Indeed. And we've got a question here from George. George is saying, in secondary schools, what structures do you think would help with this? We have a curriculum committee, but I've been pushing, for example, for links between heads of departments and governors. I think how that works in practice, George, is up to individual governing bodies, trust boards. For many years, governors have made visits based on links, and in secondary schools that seems to work quite well, because in secondary schools I think you probably would have a lot more of that ability to actually quiz a head of department, a head of faculty about the intention, the impact side of the curriculum in that particular subject, rather than perhaps the whole school, whole academy overview that you get at full governing body level. I think the one caveat I would put on that, which possibly may apply more in primary schools, is that I think what Linda and I are definitely not advocating here is that perhaps we revert back to what we saw in schools 10, 15 years ago, where we had a governor for literacy, a governor for geography, a governor for PE, etc. It doesn't need us as governors to become experts on the content of the curriculum. This is about understanding at a strategically appropriate level, what are we trying to achieve, and then how do we measure what we're achieving? Have we been successful in doing that?
And there's two aspects to that. If you're benchmarking against other secondary schools like you might be saying, well, we don't do as well in maths or science. How might we look at the curriculum in order to improve that? Or you might have considered dropping certain subjects from the curriculum, some of those around financial reasons, but does that then narrow your offer to pupils, and does that then mean that you're not meeting all pupils' needs because you've taken some things off the exam syllabus because of financial restrictions?
Okay, thank you for that. Moving on now, we'll pick up very quick. We've got a couple of quick areas to actually cover in terms of topics today, and then we'll move on to the last one, which is the relationship and sex education. The first one is the teacher recruitment service, and apologies here, we seem to have had a little bit of an alignment. The PowerPoint slide looked perfect yesterday afternoon when it was uploaded. It seems to have shifted a little bit overnight for some reason. Teacher recruitment service, as Linda said in the introduction, is a response to really what the government sees as a very high and a very significant cost to schools of recruiting teachers at a time when there are some very real supply and demand issues. Government launched this service. It's been talked about for quite a while, but it was finally launched on the 8th of April, and it's branded as teacher vacancies. It very much actually does hopefully what it says. It is free for any state-funded schools, so that's all maintained schools and academies. There is no cost at all to actually using this site. It does require you to register on it as a school, and only schools can do that. Anybody can go on and look at the front end, which is where the vacancies are, but schools, if they wish to place an ad, do actually have to register using their DFE, Department for Education number.
And it does include leadership vacancies as well as general teacher vacancies.
Yeah. And as Linda said in the intro, the Secretary of State is actually suggesting that schools should not be spending money with agencies in really acknowledgement that their fees are actually sometimes quite extortionate and represent a very real drain on school budgets, which of course should be directed towards pupils' needs rather than anything else. This is just a very quick screenshot of what the teacher vacancies page looks like. You land on it. The grey panel on the left-hand side is the search engine, and you can see there are various options and drop-down menus there. You can put your location. I just happened to put yesterday the location of our head office, which is actually in Dorking in Surrey, so that's our postcode. You can set the radius, I think, a mile, 5 miles, 10 miles, up to about 30 or even 50 miles. If you want a subject to be put on there, you can actually, so for a secondary example, you'd always be looking for subject specifics. You might be in primary as well. You don't have to fill it in if you don't want to. Job title, this one says I just put teacher in, but as Linda says, leadership posts are included as well, and you can see the other boxes too. As it happens, my search yesterday only, because I'd only put a 5 mile radius, only came up with one match, but I think, Linda, was it 30?
There were 18,000 jobs on there a couple of weeks ago when I last looked at the numbers. The other interesting thing that you could do is put a wider search, a wider radius in, and you can look at what competition you're up against with your vacancy, which is quite useful as well. A question from Ellen around, we are all at the moment, I'm a chair of governors in the school myself, we are all trying to recruit our staff for September. Many of us had started the recruitment process with other commercial services supporting us in the recruitment before this search engine was launched. It is more important to get the right people in post for September, so I think this will work alongside initially, with the intention that once everybody knows about it, it will become the place to go first.
Indeed. And I think we have seen, and those of you on social media will probably be aware, the DfE have been promoting this, certainly on Twitter, and I'm sure on Facebook as well. So I think, yeah, you're right. It'll hopefully not be a slow burn, but it'll take a little while for it to get fully established and become the go-to place. Similarly as with the other one, we've got a few questions that governors and trustees might like to reflect on here.
And this is around reporting, what you see when you get information from your head teacher, what you look at when you're thinking about your management and oversight of the budget. Do you know how much you spent on teacher recruitment last year? How aware are you of what the profile of staff turnover is going to be for this September? We're coming up to that key date on the 31st of May when teachers need to have resigned if they're to take up a post in September. And importantly, do you know whether your school had registered on this website? Certainly my school wasn't aware of it. They are now, and the vacancies are actually actively listed. But it may be that you are the first person in your school or academy to be aware of it. Even if you're not sure about that, too much information is often better than none at all. So checking that your school is actually aware of it and has started to register and use it.
And Rosemary has just put a comment up. We could do with a site like this for recruiting governors. I mean, dare I say, governors for schools actually this is the main area of their responsibility, of course, Rosemary. So yeah, by all means, if you have any vacancies, then make sure that you are registered with governors for schools and actually take advantage of the excellent service that they do actually provide. Okay, moving rapidly on.
Okay, again, we're staying with the financial side of things, and there was an announcement made on the 10th of April, which was largely awaited. Been a number of discussions around this after the increases in teacher pension contributions from around 16% to around 23%. So it was quite a hike. It wasn't going to be funded originally. There was a lot of noise about the fact that it should be, and on the 10th of April the DfE announced that it would be fully funded for 2019-20. It'll appear in two tranches. The first is worked out on a formula based on your pupil numbers, and that amount of money will appear in your budget without any action by the school. The second part is the difference between what that formula looked like and what the reality is in your school, and that bit will need to be applied for and will come to your school in the as a grant. But if you don't apply for it, you won't get it. It's not automatic. As I said, it's just 2019-20 at this stage. We are coming into the time where we're thinking about what will be the outcomes of the spending review, which will occur later this year, and there are no guarantees on any of those things. There's sort of little nudges that it's unlikely that pupil premium and sports funding will disappear, but there's no guarantee on anything until we see the results of that. So this will need to feature in your initial conversations as a fully funded option, but looking forward to your 3-year forecasting, until we know what that spending review will say, we can't really start to predict how that might look in the future.
And really, those questions on this slide now do echo what Linda's just said there. So just think about, yes, many of us knew this was coming, but did we make provision for it in this year's budget or not? So it may well be we've got a slight contingency now if we did make provision for it. Is there a need to review the budget? And again, as Linda says, future planning. Okay, so at this stage we will move into the final topic for this morning's session, which is the new statutory guidance on relationship and sex education. This was published quite a while ago, tail end of February, but we certainly haven't talked about this in any of the webinars that we've done recently for Governors for Schools, which is why we felt it was important to add it in this morning's webinar. I think it's also fair to say that this is topical. As I heard on the 7 o'clock news this morning, a report that there are, I think it was 9 local authorities, I think were quoted, where groups of parents have made specific complaints about this guidance and the implications it has for the way in which relationship and sex education will be taught statutorily from September 2020.
And it links back to the Ofsted new framework because it is a curriculum area.
Indeed.
And so there are those absolute direct links, and it will be inspected.
Now you will note on the, and again I thought it was important to actually put this on here, some of you may have seen the draft guidance already, which is featured on the left-hand side of the screen in front of you now. However, the House of Lords finally approved the regulations after the approval in the unanimous approval in the House of Commons a few weeks before that, just at the tail end of last month. And so if you were to download this document today, it no longer has the February 2019 date on it, and it no longer says draft. So this is actually on the statute books now. These are regulations that do come into force in September next year.
And they already feature, as I said, in the Ofsted framework. I'll just give you a little bit of a flavour. Whilst it is law from September 2020, there is quite an expectation. So in the handbook it says from September 2019 schools are able to follow a new relationships and sex education and health education curriculum. From September 2020 they will be required by law to follow it. Primary age school children must be taught about positive relationships and respect for others and how these are linked to promoting good mental health and well-being. Again, a subject lots of schools are actively thinking about how they manage within their setting. And sex education will become mandatory at secondary level. So there is a must aspect of this. If a school's failing to meet its obligations, inspectors will consider this when reaching the personal development judgment. So this is where that sits within that those 4 judgments, and it becomes statutory. So already schools are on this journey. There won't be any school that has nothing on its curriculum in any of these relationship and sex education areas, but there's an expectation that will be in place as much as possible by September 2019, with a move to those more sensitive areas in a more considered and careful way by 2020.
And if we think about the backdrop to this, some of you may not be aware, but the previous statutory regulations applying to what was formerly called sex and relationship education hadn't changed for well over 20 years. So they were long overdue a review. There was a lot of talk in Head Teacher Association conferences last year, lots of talk in Ofsted, and lots of talk from certain diocesan organisations as well. These new regulations are long overdue, but I think it's fair to say they're probably not without a little bit of controversy. What we try to do on this next slide is just pick out what we believe are the key elements. It's not the complete summary, but these are the key elements that governors perhaps need to be thinking about. Some of you will be aware that it has always been probably since the 1944 Education Act, I'm guessing, the right of parents to withdraw their children from certain elements of sex education. And when we say certain elements, it means those elements of sex education which are not included within the National Curriculum for Science. And you'll see there is a slight change here, because what Ofsted, what the DFE rather are saying now in this new statutory guidance is parents have the right to request withdrawal from some of the sex education. The guidance document itself goes into quite a lot of detail to suggest and perhaps set a level of expectation that head teachers and school leaders will be having conversations, meaningful conversations with parents who do request withdrawal to try and persuade them that actually this is in their children's best interest. And this comes back to Linda's point about personal development, well-being, mental health, etc. The implications of not preparing children and young people for the big wide world beyond their family unit, beyond their school gates, by denying them the opportunity to engage in certain elements of the curriculum, that should be a worry for an awful lot of us.
And the curriculum overall is designed to give knowledge and skills. So the knowledge element of this and the relationship and personal development skills of being able to use the knowledge you've acquired as it applies to you does not mean that the school is promoting a change that would be against your own personal view, your family views, your cultural views. This is about providing you with knowledge so that in a multicultural environment, in a working environment, in a university environment, you are prepared to cope with some of the things that you may be newly exposed to. I went to university with a girl from a very, very religious background. She went home after 6 weeks with anxiety because she couldn't cope with the fact that there were condom machines in the girls' toilets, because she was totally unprepared. So it is about trying to give young people enough knowledge to make decisions about themselves, keep themselves safe, and to form positive relationships for themselves going forward.
And of course, there's a huge overlap here between the relationship and sex education curriculum and PSHE, which is personal, social and health education, or whatever variation of that is called in your own schools and academies. And one of the areas that, of course, again, links back into the curriculum, of course, is how we teach e-safety, how we make children aware of the dangers of, internet activity, social networking, gaming, all of those things in a virtual world. And the emphasis and the guidance here is about ensuring that children and young people understand the distinction between reality and perhaps an online world, which an awful lot of them spend increasing amounts of time in. We've talked a little bit about faith perspectives already. The guidance makes it very clear that schools may teach about faith perspectives. To put that into context, what that actually means is the law says you have to teach certain elements of, sorry, have to teach everything that is actually within this new element of the curriculum, but it is then able, schools are able, where they feel appropriate, to say, but of course, in our faith or in certain faiths, this is not the common view. It does not mean that you just teach the faith perspective and ignore, as Linda said, equipping children and young people with the knowledge, the skills to be able to live and to thrive in the modern world.
And again, there may be some teachers in schools that are not necessarily confident, able, and willing to teach that full curriculum in that topic. Any discrimination by an organisation or an individual in applying those regulations is a breach of the Equality Act. So again, we need to think carefully about how and who will be delivering these elements, and it's across another range, both collective worship, through science, through PHSE. There'll be elements of this right the way through. A number of people within your school delivering parts of that. Are they all well trained, well equipped, and confident and willing to do to provide this in a good way?
I mentioned a few minutes ago about some of the drivers for this this updated set of regulations. One of the drivers, of course, was the fact that certain academies, secondary ones specifically, opted out because they could of delivering any sex education or because it wasn't in line with their values. That now becomes illegal under the law. So it's another example of where the law, particularly with regard to equality, now needs to actually be fully in place. And of course, that's a governance responsibility because it's about compliance. The area that is causing quite a lot of controversy, and this was the focus of the radio programmes this morning, is actually the requirement to teach children that in 21st century Britain, family can take on a whole variety of different structures and can mean a lot of different things to different children in different settings. And the 2 bullet points that are in italics at the bottom here, those are both quotes directly from the guidance. So you can see on this one, so teaching about families requires sensitive and well-judged teaching based on knowledge of pupils and their circumstances. And again, coming back to this idea of knowing the context in which we operate, most of us will have children, young people in our schools, where to them the family unit could be living with grandparents, it could be living with aunts and uncles, it could be a single family unit, it could be a same-sex couple, it could be any variation of those. There are children who are living in foster care, children who've been in foster care, who are now in adoptive care. But again, they all have a family, but family means something different, and that's where the sensitivity has to be brought in. And it's, this would not be an area where schools should be even contemplating talking about contradicting the Equalities Act here by being seen in any way to show any kind of disdain or disrespect or surprise at some of those family units that exist in their schools.
And for many schools, there are already teaching materials, library materials available to children that bring them into that community by providing reading materials and topical discussion about the normality of being in a family that doesn't look exactly the same as everybody else's. I think this, the discussion of parents thinking that something new and different is going to be shared with their children, when actually a lot of this is already happening in schools already, and with no real concern being raised. Children are much more accepting of difference than sometimes adults are.
So just in terms of some questions we may actually want to reflect on this, again, do we know about it back in school? Is this something that has actually been looked at by school leadership? Has it actually been focused on by the people leading PSHE? Or perhaps there might be a specific team doing relationship and sex education, but the school needs to be aware of. They're no longer draft, but it may be the draft regulations that they've got hold of, but they haven't changed at all. Do we anticipate there might be some issues with parents when the school thinks about what compliance will actually look like here? Because that's something that, and certainly the focus of the radio programme, Rich is asking a question, which radio station was it the discussion on? I don't hate to admit it, I normally listen to Radio 4 on my journey to work in the morning, but on the way home I was working quite late last night, so I was listening to Magic Radio. That's where I heard the news this morning, Richard, but please don't judge me on that. I think their news is provided by Sky, actually. But again, serious point, compliance here is actually not an option. And we do know that in certain communities, certain groups of parents have already been mobilised and actually quite active in terms of their opposition. And in some instances, that can actually lead to some quite difficult discussions being had, very often in social media, so being played out in a rather public arena. And school leaders, head teachers, and sometimes as governors, we might find ourselves being drawn into that. So I think it's actually important that we do reflect on what our responses may be if we are challenged on this. And of course, there are some implications that we may need to actually review our policies, and a number of different policies, because we've already mentioned that this has crossover into curriculum, it has crossover into safeguarding, has crossovers into a whole different number of aspects of school life. And of course, you may well have a specific policy on relationship and sex education now. Historically, I've been very aware that some infant schools, particularly perhaps, had a sex education policy that simply said, we do not teach sex education. That's not sufficient anymore, because it's not just sex education. This is relationship and sex education. And I don't think we made this point earlier, but the observant ones amongst you will probably have noticed that it's no longer sex and relationship, which is what it used to be. It's now relationship and sex. And one assumes that the implication there is that's the order in which it ought to occur.
And relationship compulsory in primary schools and sex education compulsory in secondary schools, but there are elements of science, how your body works in years 5 and 6 in primary, that, as Steve mentioned earlier, are part of the national curriculum offer already.
And we've got one last quick poll that we'd like to do before we finish this morning, folks. And as you can see on the screen in front of you now, that's actually linked to this idea of relationship and sex education, and have we considered the implications of it in our school? So poll is up in front of you now, and I can see quite a few are voting rather rapidly on this, so thank you for that. Okay, if anybody else wants to vote, just give you a couple of moments to do that. We're up into the high 70s now, so we're getting close. Okay, looks as if we've got most people voted now, so I'm going to close the poll at that point and share those results with you. This is quite an interesting spread we've got here. Just over a third of people, 34%, are saying yes, schools already considered it. 9% no, 21% is on the agenda this term, but actually another just over a third don't actually know. So clearly, call to action, go back to school and ask about that. If you're a chair, perhaps talk to the clerk. Is it going to be on the agenda either for a committee meeting or for a full governing body meeting this summer term? Okay, and that brings us to the end of what Linda and I wanted to raise this morning. But if there are any outstanding questions, then now's your opportunity to fire those across to us.
Appreciate we've taken a little bit more of your time this morning than we would normally, but a new Ofsted framework always generates a lot of interest.
So don't see many questions coming through right now. So I guess at this point we will say thank you very much indeed again for joining us this morning, and thank you for all of those excellent questions and comments that have come across. That truly does make it interactive, which is always nice to see from our point of view. Enjoy the rest of your day. The sun's shining here. I hope it is with you, and we look forward to welcoming you to future Governors for Schools webinars. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.